because all the bureaucrats and all the deep state actors buried within the government of Alberta, most of whom were appointed by the NDP, desperately want to avoid liability and desperately don't want anybody suggesting that their unfettered dictatorial power over all of us should be the subject of damages claims when they get caught doing things illegally, right? That's what this case is really about. And you can bet that, the Department of Justice is going to continue to get instructions from bureaucrats, not from Danielle Smith, but from bureaucrats within the Department of Justice that are layers down from the Premier, probably even layers down from the Attorney General, although Mickey Amory was part of the COVID cabinet, so I'm sure he wants to continue the cover up. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a lot of people within the bureaucracy that have a vested interest in trying to continue the cover up and continue to keep the citizens of Alberta from realizing how poorly served they were by the government of Alberta throughout the COVID pandemic.
Remember the peak of COVID hysteria when rolling restrictions on freedom of movement and economic liberty were imposed on the entire population indiscriminately, all under the imagined guise of stopping the spread or flattening the curve of a seasonal respiratory virus known as COVID-19? Well, now law firm Rath & Co. has launched a class action lawsuit challenging the Alberta government's COVID-19 public health orders, accusing the province of political maneuvering and disproportionately targeting small business owners. After all, they were forced to shutter while big box stores like Costco and Walmart remained open. And when small businesses were finally allowed to reopen, they were forced to do so with great limitations, from capacity restrictions to the mandatory installation of plexiglass barriers, floor stickers that were somehow supposed to mitigate infection, with hand sanitizing and mask dispensing stations, all at great cost to their bottom line. Lawyers Jeffrey Rath and Eva Chipiuk intend to argue that the province, overseen by then Premier Jason Kenney, acted in bad faith and negligence, with plaintiffs seeking compensation for the damages caused by these public health orders. Their lawsuit hinges on the precedent of the Ingram decision, which found that orders implemented under the Public Health Act were breached when politicians, instead of the then Chief Medical Officer of Health, Tina Hinshaw, implemented them. Joining me now to discuss this case is Rath and Chipiuk to share insights and especially how the Ingram decision precursors their action.
By pretending to be issuing lawful orders under the Public Health Act and pretending not to have anything to do with these things, in effect, Kenney, his cabinet, Hinshaw, all of the people that were involved in this conspiracy, were intentionally hiding the fact that they didn't have the authority to do what they were doing. They were doing, we don't have to prove this to win our case, but I know from sources internal to the government that they knew that what they were doing was illegal. They knew that they should have been, proceeding under the Emergencies Management Act. But let's face it, Kenney and, Jason Nixon and, Tyler Shandro and Jason Copping, thank God he didn't get reelected. But, all of these people, none of them wanted to face their constituents and say, oh, yeah, well, we're really sorry we destroyed your business, but we needed to do it because Trudeau told us to, right? None of them wanted to take that responsibility for their cowardice, for not standing up to the great Justin Trudeau, King of Canada, and telling them to go get bent because these orders were stupid, right? So instead of doing that, they again hid behind Tina Hinshaw, and that's why we have causes of action that we're pursuing by class action.
Although these orders have been deemed illegal, the province was trying to justify its actions and defend its position at the certification hearing, which Chipiuk explains more about and elaborates on why they don't have to prove intent, but rather that the province knew what it was doing would cause irreversible damage to small businesses.
And it was really interesting to see how the province was kind of defending itself, even though we all know that through a decision of the Court of King's Bench, it's already been illegal, and the province just simply doesn't want to acknowledge it, have responsibility for it. Let's just kind of ignore it. Everybody tried their best and let's move on was kind of part of the argument, and trying to demand that we show intention. But as Jeff said, that's not the case.
Because I said, how could this not be in bad faith? I mean, they knew that from our perspective, They knew or should have known what their own law was. They knew or should have known that what they were doing was illegal. They knew or should have known that the reason that they were doing this was to avoid and evade political responsibility for their decisions and pretend that these were medical decisions as opposed to, as opposed to political decisions. And even the judge was, when he was quizzing the province, was saying, well, you're saying that none of this was foreseeable. And he said, certainly when you issued these orders, the government knew that people were going to be harmed. Right? You knew who the people were that were going to be harmed because the orders were targeted at them. And that's what I was pointing out to the judge. I said, they say we can't define the class. I said, the orders themselves, they were able to identify him well enough to haul him away in handcuffs, for continuing to try to operate his business in the face of these illegal orders. Right? So, these are the types of games that the government's playing. I hope Danielle Smith is paying attention and understand that her lawyers are making her look really bad to her constituents because they're going in and making, arguments that just fly in the face of common sense or an insult to all of the Albertans whose lives were destroyed by these orders, including the numerous people who literally were driven to suicide and the families that are still living to this day with the tragedy that Dina Hinshaw, Jason Kenney, and all of his little cocktail drinking Sky Palace fiends inflicted on the province of Alberta. Let's assume for a minute that everything that was done throughout the pandemic was done appropriately, that somehow or other shutting down these businesses and destroying businesses and all the economic devastation was for a bona fide public health purpose. It's a big assumption to make, but let's just assume that that's true. On what planet is it fair or reasonable to have one small segment of society, specifically, small to medium-sized business owners, have to bear the brunt of public health costs and measures for the benefit of society as a whole, without society as a whole having to compensate them for those losses?
I like how Jeff described it. A small segment of society was harmed. And what the province actually also gave us evidence of is how much money went into the public sector. We were given information and evidence, and it's all on Rath and Company website, that the province spent $13 billion over 3 years in COVID programs and support for the public sector. So why aren't we talking about that? Where do we draw the line that was okay, but private sector, let's just forget about them because they can deal with it themselves. So we don't even know how much the government gave private sectors through grants because the witness wasn't able to reconcile. And she's the top accountant from the province. So it was somewhere between $650 million to maybe $750 million, but quite a discrepancy between the two.
Chipiuk further elaborates on Supreme Court of Canada case law from 1959, which established that government officials cannot use discretionary powers to arbitrarily interfere with an individual or their business operations, legal rights, particularly when motivated by personal or political bias. Known as the Frank Roncarelli versus Duplessis case, Roncarelli was a Jehovah's Witness and restaurant owner who successfully sued the Quebec Premier Duplessis after his liquor license was revoked in retaliation of his financial support of persecuted Jehovah's Witnesses.
In Quebec, the premier at the time, it was quite a political time, and people were getting sent to jail for pamphlets and spreading things. And one business owner took it upon himself to bail people out for these bogus charges. So he was bailing people out. The premier at the time got a hold of this information and he's like, we need to shut down his business. We're going to take away his license for alcohol. This was a long established business, never had any issues. And then so the business owner went to court and said there was something, this wasn't right. The premier stepped in, illegally took away my license to sell alcohol on no basis. So very similar what we're saying here. It was ultra virus is what the court said. And in the end, he had to pay damages, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So to me, these cases are so important. This case that we're on is right now is so important because government only has authority to do what it's actually given itself authority to do. And then in that case, and in this case, it didn't do what it was supposed to. So we need to hold the government to account.
Rath elaborates on the magnitude of damage that some of these businesses allege and they are representing suffered at the hands of the stay home to save lives pseudo-science, and how the government is now trying to wash its hands of any responsibility.
But one of the business people that we represent, represents a medium-sized, business. It's a fairly large chain of restaurants in northern Alberta. He has a $12 million hole in his balance sheet because in order to survive COVID, he literally said, at the start of COVID, I could, basically say I was debt free. So I had the same lines of credit as any other businessman, but I could walk in and write a check for him any day of the week that I wanted to say I was debt free. But he says, as a result of all of these ridiculous closure orders, open again, close again, do this, do that, whatever. He said, I had to borrow a very large amount of money to keep my business afloat and keep my staff paid and keep everybody standing by for when we could reopen. And he said, when the dust cleared, he said, I found I had a new partner in my business that I didn't have. It's called a bank. And I now owe the bank $12 million and I'm paying $40,000 in interest every month to service this debt that I was forced to incur through COVID to keep my business intact. So he says, when Danielle Smith, speaks about the Alberta advantage, sure, it's great if you're a new business coming to Alberta and starting from scratch on the ruins of all the other businesses that have been destroyed through COVID. But he says, what about us that are still trying to operate in Alberta, that have been here paying taxes for 40, 50 years, right? That are now in this massive hole that we're trying to dig ourselves out of because of illegal decisions made by the government of Alberta. At one point, the Alberta government lawyers' arguments were so bizarre. They were going in and trying to argue that the government of Alberta couldn't be held responsible for all the harm caused by the orders because the government of Alberta itself wasn't the one causing the harm, right? It was AHS that was causing the harm, and AHS isn't part of the government of Alberta. And the RCMP were causing the harm by helping AHS close businesses down, and they're not part of the government of Alberta. Well, the judge, leave aside the fact that RCMP act under contract to the government of Alberta, but the judge looked at the Alberta government lawyer and said, you realize that I made a decision a year or two ago that pointed out that there's absolutely no daylight between, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, between AHS and the government of Alberta. And that in that decision, I pointed out that in the last few years, the government on no fewer than 2 separate occasions has fired the entire board of AHS and replaced them with their own board, right? So he said it lies. And the judge looked right at this government lawyer, and this is almost a verbatim quote, look right at this Alberta government lawyer and says, you need to hear from me that it lies ill in the mouth of an Alberta government lawyer to stand up in my courtroom and try to tell me that AHS is separate and apart from the government of Alberta, right? So those are the types of arguments that they're making, because all the bureaucrats and all the deep state actors buried within the government of Alberta, most of whom were appointed by the NDP, desperately want to avoid liability and desperately don't want anybody suggesting that their unfettered dictatorial power over all of us should be the subject of damages claims when they get caught doing things illegally, right? That's what this case is really about. And you can bet that, the Department of Justice is going to continue to get instructions from bureaucrats, not from Danielle Smith, but from bureaucrats within the Department of Justice that are layers down from the Premier, probably even layers down from the Attorney General, although Mickey Amory was part of the COVID cabinet, so I'm sure he wants to continue the cover up. So this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a lot of people within the bureaucracy that have a vested interest in trying to continue the cover up and continue to keep the citizens of Alberta from realizing how poorly served they were by the government of Alberta throughout the COVID pandemic.
Anyone in Alberta who has had their business negatively impacted by COVID restrictions can go to rathandcompany.com and click on the business class action website link to become part of the class action and find all of the relevant documents supporting the claim there. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. Did you know that the government is trying to pass a sweeping pandemic bill known as Bill C-293? We've called it the Vegan Bill because it seeks to further regulate and phase out animal agriculture in favor of what they call alternative proteins under the guise of pandemic prevention. Head on over to killtheveganbill.com. There you can learn more about this bill, and you can also sign our petition and send a form email to senators telling them to kill the vegan bill at killtheveganbill.com.